Are things between India and Canada likely to get much worse before they get any better? I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our focus continues on the big geopolitical global story, the clash between India and Canada after Trudeau made an astonishing claim on the floor of Canada's parliament, alleging an Indian link to the killing of Khalistani terrorist Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Since then, India has described Canada to be a safe haven for terrorists, language normally reserved for Pakistan. We have been speaking to victims, to families of the victims of the Air India bombing of the 1980s, the worst mass death in aviation history till 9/11 came along. And we've been talking about the massive cover up by Canadian authorities where families wait for justice till this day. It's just one illustration of how, over the decades, Canada has both enabled and protected Khalistani groups. And yet, Canada's focus continues to be on Hardeep Singh Nijjar as some sort of ordinary civilian. India has, of course, flatly denied having anything to do with the killing of Nijjar and demanded that the Canadians demonstrate proof. In the meantime, the geopolitical ramifications are building up. US Secretary of State Tony Blinken has spoken about condemning what he called transnational repression. What will America do, especially since it's now clear that at least some of the intel came from the grouping known as the Five Eyes, including the United States of America? Joining us on the program today, our newsmaker is Michael Rubin. Michael is a former Pentagon official. He is presently with the American Enterprise Institute, the AEI. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us this early, your time of day. We appreciate it. Let me start by asking you your thoughts on where and how the crisis stands right now.
Well, the United States is simply hoping that this exits the headlines, that whatever has happened can be addressed much more quietly. They don't think the spotlight is useful for U.S. interests, let alone for the broader partnership. That said, look, the United States has taken a more serious line towards Khalistani separatism and Sikh extremism. We've seen this with the arrest in Sacramento last April of 2017. We've seen the nexus of gun running, drug smuggling, and so forth. And so behind the scenes, I believe there is some frustration with Canada as well, that it has become such a weak link on these efforts.
That's interesting that you say that behind the scenes there is some frustration in America, because the US Secretary of State's comments in public seemed to lean towards Canada, was the perception of many pundits here in India. When you heard Tony Blinken calling upon India to cooperate with the Canadians, talking about condemning what he called transnational repression, what did you think? Did you think that was just rhetorical, or did you think that there might be two views in the United States on how to handle this?
I think that Tony Blinken was trying to square the circle. I certainly did not hear an outright accusation against India. I mean, simply saying there should be an investigation can go either way. Within the intelligence community, I'm pretty certain there's frustration with Canada for even acknowledging and putting the United States in the position to reveal the sources and methods. That we spy on India and we spy on Canada for that matter, that shouldn't be a surprise. Frankly, India spies on both of us as well. Democracies do it. It's a different quality than what we might have. I mean, if Russia does it, if China does it, and so forth. But I found the transnational repression statement a little bit worrisome. Now, and also hypocritical, if I may, considering the United States does things like this as well, meaning we will take out Osama Bin Laden, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Qasem Soleimani, and others. What I worry about moving forward is not the State Department, it's not the White House, it's the Congress. Because too often now in our political, polarized society in the United States, foreign policy has become a national security football. India's strength, our relations, have been that it has been bipartisan. We haven't worried whether it's a Democrat or Republican. What else could George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden agree on than on India? But if congressional progressives decide they want to make an issue of this, I'm afraid of what that could do in the long term to U.S. relations with India. We've already seen what it's done with U.S. relations with both Israel and Saudi Arabia.
So, in a way, you're worried that the bipartisan sort of support for better relations with India could be damaged if this is not contained very soon.
That would be my worry, though honestly, it's not a huge worry right now. Look, Khalistani extremists based in California have embraced Hinduphobia. They've tried to go after Prime Minister Modi at every opportunity, and it hasn't stuck yet. What we're going to see now is a test about whether their efforts, and their efforts aren't organic, they're being directed from outside, whether their efforts have any gravity. I don't think they do. I think US-India relations are going to continue to thrive.
Let's talk about what's happened in the last few hours. Khalistani groups threatened to shut down Indian consulates. What happened in the end was a pretty muted affair, but you still saw Khalistanis, if we can play those images, surround the Indian consulate. But we've seen much worse happen before. In this instance, you had the Indian flag being burnt, you had the Prime Minister's effigies being burnt, you had all of that happening. But in the past, we've actually seen tableaus celebrating the assassination of an Indian Prime Minister. You've seen Kill India posters putting a mark on the back of Indian diplomats, literally endangering their lives. And you've, of course, seen the notorious Air India bombing, which till 9/11 happened and the Twin Towers came crumbling down, was the worst episode of its kind in global aviation history. And yet Canada sent only one man to jail for those killings, in which 329 people died. And even that man was released ahead of time. Why is it, you think, that the world or the Americans have not made noise about Canada's patronage of Khalistani terror? Give me a second. Let me unmute you. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
I hate to say this, but I think the reason is not enough Americans have been killed to gather our attention. Americans famously navel gaze. We can be self-centered when it comes to our own national security. We don't understand that other countries, other democracies have their own interests and have their own groups who are trying to destabilize their democracies. That said, the silver lining for this episode will be that no one will ever again ignore, in the United States or Canada, if they're wise, Khalistani extremism, Khalistani terrorism. We had a start of a wake-up call in the United States with regard to the attack on the San Francisco consulate. You're absolutely right on that. I would add that the United States has been slow to hold people to account. Of course, there's surveillance video. Why aren't we going after the people who perpetrated the violence? We shouldn't let this get so far that Americans end up dying. And at this point, I think that certainly in the intelligence community and now at the political level, people realize that this is a huge issue and that we can't be serious in regards to our own counterterrorism if we don't attack and address this issue. And I would also just add, there's a growing acknowledgement, perhaps, that, the Khalistani extremists have no domestic legitimacy whatsoever. I would say, based on a study group at Hudson Institute that Hussein Haqqani had led, that, the Pakistanis had tried to stir up terrorism in Kashmir. Kashmir has thrived. I was there last year, ever since the abrogation of the cancellation of 370. Now that Indian Kashmir is doing better than Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, Pakistan's simply trying a plan B, which is to try to destabilize once again Punjab. We can't be naive about this. If Prime Minister Trudeau wants to be the ISI's useful idiots, that's on him. But the United States shouldn't fulfill that role.
That's a very interesting comment, and I'm glad you brought up the Pakistan connection, because that Hudson Institute study that links actually that actually looks at Khalistan as part of Pakistan's playbook is very critical, and I'm glad you've made that link. Do you think the U.S. administration gets that? And I ask you this because there's a lot of attention in our part of the world, and the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan's visit to Gilgit-Baltistan, even the American ambassador to India has been questioned on it. Do you think that the American administration gets this link? Because the American media, or large chunks of it, doesn't seem to. They continue to describe Nijjar as a plumber, as a community leader, as an activist. They don't seem to be willing to use the word secessionist, extremist, or terrorist for him. So can you speak a little bit about this ISI link and your concern that Trudeau's willing to be the useful idiot of the ISI? Great quote, by the way. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think the United States fully appreciates this. at a broader level. But first of all, let's understand the United States can be very provincial at times. We tend not to understand much about the outside world, not to have focus. Indian media is now all over the globe. American media, because of financial cutbacks, tends not to be. And so people are getting their information secondhand. Where do they get their information from? Oftentimes from the loudest voices. They will see a protest in Sacramento, California, for example, and assume that that person is legitimate. The fact of the matter is, those who are most often on Twitter, those who are most often staging these protests are not the mainstream. This is the message which the Indian government needs to start to give. Now, I'm very, very glad that after months, more than a year of not actually having a confirmed U.S. ambassador in Delhi, we now do. And it behooves that ambassador to make this a priority, because when a U.S. ambassador goes to Delhi, he represents U.S. interests, not Indian interests. But in this case, there's a symbiosis. We are the two world's largest democracies, and we both have a mutual interest in terrorists and terrorism not destabilizing our countries. The flavors of terrorism which may target our countries may be a little bit different, but that doesn't mean we can ignore each other's security concerns. For too long, the Americans have ignored everyone else's security concerns and prioritized ours. We need to address all extremism, all foreign-backed extremism that targets democracies.
Talk a little bit about your simile, which spoke of India and Canada being like an ant and an elephant.
Well, in this case, look, Canada is, of course, an important country to the United States. It's the world's largest undefended border, that thousands of kilometer-long border between Canada and the United States. We have economic partnership and so forth. But when it comes to strategy, when it comes to national security, there's been growing frustration with regard to Canada. First of all, this isn't the only issue we have with Canada right now in the United States. Canada, there's a wide bipartisan feeling, hasn't upheld its defense obligations, which is one of the reasons why it hasn't been included in the AUKUS partnership, which is becoming a much broader alliance. At the same time, we're naive if we don't talk about the rise of China. China is, of course, the greatest strategic concern the United States faces right now. We're actively pivoting away from the Middle East for that reason. And because of that, India is our chief ally. We don't want to be dragged down into a pointless political diplomatic fight simply because of Justin Trudeau's personality and because he decided to shoot from the hip. I don't get the sense from hearing any of the statements that American officials have made, including the American ambassador in Canada, David Cohen, that the United States was caught by anything other than surprise when Justin Trudeau announced this 9 days ago or so from the parliamentary floor. Now, when it comes to U.S. intelligence sharing with Canada, the murder of Nijjar happened, and then we weren't paying close attention. We gave Canada what intelligence we may have had. And what we do know from the New York Times and from others is that while our intelligence helped color and give context, it didn't provide a smoking gun. That Canada did on its own, and now there's a sense that Justin Trudeau is trying to blame others for his own mistake. Look, as a Pentagon official in the past, I consumed intelligence. I received the reports from the CIA, from the National Security National Security Agency, and so forth. It's like having pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. It seldom gives you a clear picture. Policymakers never have a clear picture to their comfort when they need to make a decision. And in this case, it would be no different. Justin Trudeau is lying if he suggests otherwise.
Let me pick up this last point about the US having shared intelligence, but not having possibly understood what Trudeau was going to do with it. And as you said, they're pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. There was no smoking gun in there. The Canadians have wanted to stress again and again that this intel came from the Americans. When the American ambassador to Canada did in fact concede that some of the intel would have come from the Americans, the Canadians used that as code for, hey, the Americans are on our side in this. The other narrative prevailing is that the Americans knew about this well before the G20, that the Biden administration prevailed upon Trudeau to not sabotage the G20 and not raise this in public, but did not necessarily know that he was going to raise it in this manner in Canada's parliament.
I think I think that all may be true. You know, when it comes to giving context, again, that context could have been the murder of Rapudaman Singh Malik. That could have been that there were other Sikh elements out there who were gunning after Nijjar. There's a lot of context. Now, when people after the fact say, oh, Canadian intelligence have warned Nijjar that there was a hit coming on him, that could also be some elements within the Sikh community in Canada trying to simply benefit from this crisis. I wouldn't necessarily take it all seriously. When it comes to the G20, was this an issue that was discussed behind the scenes? People might have said, India, did you have anything to do with this? And Prime Minister Modi has said, no, this wasn't on us. And let's also be blunt. If it comes to something like signals intelligence, Indian security is too professional to talk about doing anything like this on the open phone lines. That's why also this is unbelievable and why there's a crisis of confidence in the way which Prime Minister Trudeau has handled this. Now, when we move forward, I mean, what Justin Trudeau will do, I don't know, but this has been a hit to the Five Eyes, because when you do share intelligence, you want that intelligence to remain secret. You don't want to set up a situation in which it needs to be exposed. If you want to blame someone politically, and that's a cost. Let's compare this to Jamal Khashoggi, a man who I knew who was murdered by Saudi agents in the Istanbul consulate in 2018. In this case, the Turks were willing to come forward and provide the proof right away. They were willing to sacrifice the fact that they had bugged the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. If Justin Trudeau is not willing to do any of this, he should have kept his mouth shut, especially when there is no proof. And let's not forget, the premier of British Columbia has said that he had not seen any definitive proof. He's simply seen a glorified Google search. This reminds me a little bit of the run-up into the famous British dossier about some of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction ahead of the 2003 Iraq War. In that case, the British, when they had presented a dossier, had basically plagiarized from a scholar who was shocked that his work had become the basis for this. I'm not exculpating the Americans in the Iraq issue either, but I'm saying that there is there's a parallel to the intelligence simply not being there, and intelligence agencies saying, trust me, that no longer works.
Yeah, that's a great point. The comparison to the WMD and the falsified evidence that we now know to be falsified, and nobody knew it then. What do you think might happen next? Because let's talk a little bit about China. The fact is that again and again, there are people here wondering, okay, who benefits from all of this? And who benefits from all of this is China. And ironically, Trudeau's also come under fire in his own country for not calling out Chinese foreign interference fast enough. Right? How do you see sort of the geopolitical ramifications of this? Do you think right now China is having a chuckle because there's clearly an attempt to drive a wedge, in the Western alliance and between India and America?
Having a little, certainly China's having a little bit of a chuckle, but China's situation, China's domestic problems are so great. This isn't going to be enough to derail the relationship in any meaningful way. If anything, when you break a bone, it grows back stronger, and this is what China needs to worry about. Canada might now be a bit of a weak link, an unserious link in our relationship, but this will be addressed. Certainly, the relationship between Canada and India is not in deep crisis as it may seem. It's a relationship. The crisis is between India and Prime Minister Trudeau. One of the ironies here is when the Indian press handles this issue, they will say Justin Trudeau is in over his head. He's made a mistake. When most of the Canadian journalists handle this issue, they say, Justin Trudeau is in over his head. The fact of the matter is, when you have that solidarity, that symbiosis, that the relationship is going to survive. China is a broader problem. Look, the crisis between India and Canada doesn't go anywhere close to the crisis between India and China over China's encroachment on Arunachal Pradesh, for example. And therefore, I'm not so worried in the big picture. But you're right. The United States is looking at this through the China lens. They keep telling Canada, stop trying to distract us, especially for something that may not have a basis in fact, at least not in the context which Justin Trudeau is trying to put out.
If push comes to shove, because Canada is one of the oldest sort of partners of the United States of America, if push comes to shove and the Americans need to choose a side, what might the Americans do given the China factor?
Ultimately, it's not going to come to that unless this becomes a populist issue in the US Congress. But ultimately, the United States is simply going to try to run down the clock, to use a sports metaphor, until until Prime Minister Trudeau is out of office. He's on borrowed time already. At most, he can survive until the year 2025 due to his agreement with the New Democrats, a left-leaning party inside Canada. But the fact of the matter is, snap elections could be held at any time. Most Canadians expect it. And therefore, we're hoping we don't need to make that decision. But every single month, every single year, we become closer to India. And there's a sense that whatever disputes we may have with Canada, and again, remember, Canada blockaded their border with the United States over COVID. It created a lot of tension, especially in border cities like Detroit and so forth, that those issues, we don't look at Canada the same way. And I hate to say this, in the American political context, it's both a Republican and Democratic thing. We're not prioritizing traditional alliances the way we once did. We have been throwing traditional allies under the bus, including Israel, including Saudi Arabia, including at times France. There's no reason why we wouldn't do the same thing with regard to Canada.
Fascinating. Let me ask you one last question. Do you think the Americans behind the scenes would be trying to de-escalate this crisis? And if so, what might a de-escalation involve? Because if Trudeau doesn't put public, evidence in the public domain, his own people are going to say to him, why did you do this? And if he does, it's going to escalate things more with India, because India is flatly going to deny it. We already have some idea of the human and signals int, which effectively means that Indian officials were under surveillance. That's what it kind of boils down to. And as you've already said, nobody who's smart and experienced is going to say anything incriminating on an open phone line. So if there is going to be an informal back channel mediation, what might a de-escalation look like?
Well, first of all, I'm absolutely confident that the United States is trying to de-escalate behind the scenes. Now, the Biden administration actually has a lot in common with the Trump administration on this regard. When they are saddled with crises, their strategy seems to be simply to wait until the next crisis comes and the media in the United States forgets the current crises and it goes to the back burner. Who talks about, for example now, the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan? That was never resolved, and yet the crisis has simply moved on. Right now, the United States in Washington seems already to be forgetting the whole India-Canada spat because we have the crisis between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And so there's a hope probably within the Biden administration that if they can just string this out long enough, the spotlight will move on. Behind the scenes, though, they're probably hoping that Justin Trudeau doesn't say anything to make it worse. And frankly, I think Justin Trudeau and his top advisors are starting to understand this because this is a no-win situation for him politically. He's taken a molehill and made a mountain out of it. And all he's done is focused attention on the grave incompetence with which his administration has dealt with Khalistani terrorism over the past several years.
And in the middle of it all, he also brought a Nazi to Parliament.
Absolutely. It was a bad week for Justin Trudeau.
And that's an understatement. Thank you very much, Michael. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we'll be sure to have you back with us as the story shifts. Though I think people in India and Canada, in particular diplomats, might hope that the story doesn't shift, but at least maintains holding pattern, to borrow a phrase from aviation. Thank you very much, Michael Rubin, for talking to us, and to our audience. Thanks for watching. See you soon. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.